She's on her last legs, boys. Well, it's finally happened, guys. The little tuxing 300 bar PCP compressor has finally shuffled off this mortal coil. Surprisingly, it's lasted the best part of 16 months until it started to give problems. Now, these are supposedly a maintenance-free compressor. I've already had it apart partially to have a quick look around inside of it. We've got the service kit here, so we're going to look at giving it a service today, see if we can get it up and running again. We're also going to do some sums and see whether or not it's actually paid for itself, whether it's worthwhile buying one of these miniature compressors, whether you're better off just to stick with a dive bottle or any other options out there. So I'm going to get it all apart quickly. I'll show you the tools that we're going to use. I've got a lot of footage from the other night when I partially pulled it apart. You can see that the actual body is already partially off. I'm going to get it all apart and we'll show you inside of it because there's some quite hidden nasties. Some of it's very well built and some of it's quite poorly built. We're also then going to look and see if we can sort out the horrific knock that it's got. I managed to get some quite good slow motion footage. That was quite interesting, and I think we've got a little plan now to see if we can stop the knock once we get it all back together. Right, let's get cracked on, shall we? We do have a little service kit here. We've got some spare filters. We've got some larger O-rings, which I think are probably going to be the cylinder bore, like the end caps of the bore. Probably those. We've got what appears to be a couple of check valves and a few different seals in here. A couple of different O-rings and these little flat seals. And I think there's also a bearing. Yeah, there it is, a little bearing there for the bleed valve. So hopefully we can get it going. Now, it's done quite a lot of work in the last 18 months. I thought it would probably have packed up before this. I'll give you the sums later on of whether or not it's actually worth buying one of these compared to running my dive bottles. The convenience of this, though, is pretty good. It's a shame that it's packed up, but it gives us a good excuse to tear it all down and have a look inside. Right, so I started pulling it apart the other night. We're going to overlay some footage from that so you'll sort of see it come back and forwards to today. Now, the hardest part actually of the whole disassembly of this was getting this outer casing off. A few of the screws around the outside are actually in cross-threaded, so I needed to put a sort of flat blade screwdriver in here to sort of jimmy them off and get the screws out. But realistically, that shouldn't be a problem. But the casing simply comes off like this. You do need to remove the bleed screw. Now, there is a bearing underneath of this. I'm going to quickly whip that bearing out and show you because it's absolutely minging. Look at the state of that. It's absolutely minging. It's really rusty and horrible. Now, we do get a spare bearing in the service kit, but there's also another little valve in there that has the same bearing in it. I've used that in there and I've ordered a fresh one, so we're going to get a couple more of these. These are 5mm bearings. Comes with a single one in the kit, but you're probably going to need 2 or more, and then obviously some spares going forward. Just going to pop that back in there for the moment so we don't lose it. So it's a really interesting design. We've got the main motor here. We've got a little separate gear which reduces it down. It increases the torque from the motor to the actual compressor unit. Now, this is the compressor unit itself. We've got effectively the crankshaft in here. This part here, that's sort of a D shape, that's effectively the big end bearing of the conrod. The conrod itself can be broken in half in the middle here, and then the piston is up in here. So depending on the type of compressor unit you've got, your casing is likely to look different to this, but broadly speaking, they're all very similar. They all share very similar principles. So once you've seen inside of this, it should give you a good idea of what to expect in most of the other models. Now, this is the poverty spec version. It's just got a normal analog gauge on here, and we've just got the little temperature readout. This one does not have the auto cutout functions or anything like that. Now, I would never turn my back on this one, let alone letting some Chinese wizardry turn it off. That's just asking for trouble. I would never leave it unattended, so I certainly wouldn't myself go for the auto cut-off version. But basically what we do need to do, we need to separate the conrod here, and we also need access to these long bolts that hold the 2 cylinder heads onto the piston bore. To do that, the easiest thing really is actually to remove the whole thing from the casing itself. Now, on the underside, we've got these 4 bolts here. They're 5mm hex heads, so they're standard hex keys, Allen heads. I'm going to whip them out carefully. We're also going to disconnect the wiring loom now. Depending on the space you've got in your cabinet, you may be able to leave the switches on and just disconnect your wiring. I found with this one, it's easier just to remove the switches. They've got a little plastic barb on there. Jimmy them out of there a little bit. Disconnect the cables. Just need a little pokey thing. They've got little locking tabs on there. Now, depending on how good your memory is, it's probably worth taking a few photos just so you can make sure you can reconnect it all up as you need to. A lot of these also, they wobble quite badly. Now what it is, it turns out that where the motor is the main sort of structure of the actual unit itself, depending on how tight you tighten these up and in which sequence, it flexes the main casing. So when we come back to reassemble it, we'll adjust the tightening torque on these, and that will actually adjust the chassis, and we can adjust it to make sure all 4 feet sit actually on the deck. In between the cabinet and the motor itself, you're going to have 4 little rubber feet, or little spacers if you like. They're going to drop out the bottom of there. Don't worry too much about those, we'll collect them up afterwards. When we reassemble it, they're easy to put in sequence. So, right. You see the little rubber feet are dropping out. Before we start dismantling the motor and trying to take it out of the casing, we're going to remove the wiring loom in the moment. Okay, that's all 4 of those out for the moment. I'll take off the little display, just a couple of little screws on the side here. Now interestingly, all the little circuit boards and things in here actually are well put together. They've all got insulation material on there as well. They're certainly not going to shake and vibrate loose, so that actually looks like a reasonably well put together part. What we need to do, we need to remove the yellow connector at the top. This is all of the negatives all twisted together in there. And then what we need to do, we need to remove the one that goes down to the motor. Pull that out. Right, so we've got the motor cables there. On the motor here is a little earth lead. We need to jiggle that out. We can't quite get to it because we can't get through the back of the case in here. So when we start lifting this out, we need to just lift it up enough so that we can unscrew the little terminal on the back there. And we need to just pull out these last 2 screws here. These are slightly longer screws than all the rest of them, holding the casing together. Right, now that's out, we can give that all a little wiggle. There we go. Now we can disconnect the earth lead on there. And we can lift the main unit from the body. Right, that could be set aside for the moment. So it's quite a nice compact little unit. Now interestingly, I got some pretty cool slow motion footage. I'm going to put it up now. I was wondering why it was knocking, so I was filming it here. And you can see, because this is an eccentric gear here, this is effectively the crankshaft, this piece here. That rotates that way, transfers it back to linear motion this way. But when you get to the very bottom, so bottom dead centre, the actual alignment between the motor here, this piece, and this bracket here that holds the compressor, this piece looks like it needs to be shuffled down slightly. So at the bottom of its stroke, it's actually smacking on this piece here, which is where the knock's coming from. It doesn't go right to the top. We have got 1, 2, you won't see them, 3, 4 little fixings in there. Now we may be able to just loosen those off and adjust the position of this metal bracket here. We need to lower that down relative to the motor. If we can't, we may have to just open these slots up a little bit so we can do that. So you need a little pry bar or something similar. You want to expose these 2 screws here. These are 5mm hex heads. These were very, very tight the first time I did them, so you might need a decent length Allen key to do those, or maybe a ratchet with a hex bit on the end of it, but we need to open those up now. We can split them off of there. Now these bolts look very much the same as the ones that held the motor to the body, but note these are slightly shorter. If you put the longer ones in, it will end up fouling actually on the gear there. Now this is where it gets interesting, because a lot of the machined parts in here look really quite nicely made. All the cylinder heads are nicely made, the cylinder bore is nicely made. All of these components are fairly well put together. Right, 4mm Allen key. We've got a little guide bush up the top here, that just keeps that all aligned. There's actually a little needle roller bear in that one. So all the important faces, all these actual contact faces, the inside one here, they're all nicely machined. On the outside, where it doesn't really matter, it's not machined, but the actual important faces are. Now the alignment, as I've said, between the motor and this block casing here, we do need to see if we can adjust that. We'll get back to that in a moment, but we're going to pull the compressor unit apart now. We can get to the 4 long bolts that hold it all together. Now on this one, hopefully you can see in here, there's 3 captive nuts, but there's also 1 loose nut Hopefully you can see that silvery one there. Yeah. So you might well need to get some pliers on there. Now these are 4mm hex heads on the end here. We're also going to loosen off these fittings here on the high pressure lines. We've got 10mm spanner, 12mm spanner, and somewhere there's a 13mm spanner, which I've now, where is it? So we've got 13, 12, and a 10. This little brassy looking one. Of course we want to hold that one still and undo the smaller one of the two. These are fairly tight. Strangely, this one's a 13. So we've got nice little olives on there. Now I've given this already a blowout. It had a little bit of moisture in there. It was a little bit grubby, but actually quite well put together. There's no sealant or anything like that on the olives here like you'd see in domestic plumbing at home in the UK. So we'll put it back together like it is. 4mm Allen key. Just going to loosen these off. I'm going to leave this on here for the moment. You may need to fish around in here with a pair of pliers to grab this loosen up, but I'll show you this when I've got it in my hand now. Not quite sure why that one's loosen up, but that can stand there. These ones are all captive, so the actual nuts are welded into that backing piece. Now the fact that this wasn't building pressure, the motor was spinning, everything was cycling as it ought to, I was fairly sure that it was likely to be one of the one-way valves up this end. So we've got a one-way valve in here. We've also got a bit of a sketchy O-ring there that needs sorting. We're going to get this apart because there's, in fact, there's two check valves in here. There's one in here and there's one in the back there. Right, so that's the motor assembly. That can be set aside for the moment. Right, this is your air inlet here. You've got a little gauze type filter on there, a little micron filter. I'm not quite sure how fine it is, but that's where the air goes in by the look of things. There's certainly nothing too untoward with any of that. It all looked pretty good. But once this was broken apart the first time round, it was absolutely disgusting. Right, there's an awful lot of scum in here. It looks almost like soot, dust. Not entirely sure. The actual piston rod itself is in good condition. Actually looks quite well made. It all does actually when you get in here. It's not... Oh, don't want to lose my piston ring. Right, we need to strip this all down, give it a really good clean up. Tiny little cylinder bore. It feels to be aluminium. Again, it's got a big build-up of scum in there. Nothing too untoward. There's actually very little in the way of like bore wear. You can still see where it was honed when it was made and assembled. It's actually in fairly good shape still. Right, these can just simply be pulled apart. Now, I gave it a quick wipe off the other day. I've put it back together, obviously, for this video to get you some better footage of it all. Now, all of these machined parts look really well manufactured, actually. Little piston rings on there. These are not replaceable by the look of things. I haven't seen any of these. There's a lot of spare parts available for these, but this particular piston seems to be sold just as a complete unit. Now, I've given it a quick clean up all around in here. I'm going to give it another wipe off again. We've also got another little seal in here. That runs in here, so we need to give this all a very good clean up. Now my worry with this, they were sold as a sort of maintenance-free compressor, but there's no way to actually re-oil this. Now you'd use silicone oil, pure silicone oil inside of here as your lubricating oil, but unlike an engine, there's no oiling mechanism. So the moment that that's... Actually, let's just take that piston ring off so we don't damage that. If this is just sat upright in use, the oil is just going to sit at the bottom. That must be what dried out, gone black, completely mouldy in the last case. So what I'm going to do, more for the sake of my own curiosity, when I reassemble this, I'm going to actually use some silicone grease and give this a really light slather all up inside here, really work it in nicely. I'm going to come back to it in a couple of weeks' time and see whether or not it's actually worked. I imagine it's just going to have pushed it back to each end of the actual stroke on the actual piston here. However, I'm curious because it's not going to be that easy to re-lubricate this without giving it a fairly decent strip down. A lot of guys have talked about, I see on the internet, they talk about actually popping a bit of silicone oil back down through the actual fill hose to try and lubricate this. But the problem is you've got a check valve here. So if you're putting anything in there, you're hoping that you're going to lubricate it. On this particular model, it's simply not going to work because it can't get past that check valve there. So interesting, really. I'm going to give this all a good clean up. These O-rings here came in the kit. I've already swapped these over. The ones that actually were removed from it, I've popped them back in the bag here. They actually looked in pretty good order. They're not dried out, they're not cracked, so we'll keep some spares of those. But spares for these are readily available, so I'm not too worried about that particularly. Now all of the seals in here, so this is the seal around the outside of the actual com rod itself, they're all in really good order. There's no signs of any scoring or any wear. The same with the cylinder bore, it doesn't look like it's got many miles on it at all. Now it has done quite a lot of work in the last sort of 16 to 18 months, so I'm quite happy with that. It's all going to get reassembled, but what I do want to show you, right, so in the bottom there we've got another little gauze type filter, a little micron filter. There's no obvious scum, dodgy stuff in there, nothing too untoward in there at all, so that can go back in. I've actually swapped this O-ring out already. We did get one in the service kit, so that can go back on there carefully. This is where we find all the check valves. One of these seals in here was absolutely disgusting. Look at the state of that. So it looks very much like the inside of the actual cylinder bore itself, completely minging. Now that is corrosion. Now of course the biggest problem with all of these little compressors is that they are going to be drawing in potentially damp air, compressing it. That moisture's got to go somewhere. Now when you've got a decent moisture trap on the end of your fill hose, you can mitigate that going into your rifle quite well, but once it's in the actual compressor itself, it ends up staying there. Now some of the later versions of these have a little moisture trap on them, which is going to be a useful addition. This one doesn't have one, so once that moisture is in there, you can't get it out very well at all. Right, that O-ring is knackered. Right, so underneath of there, this is the main check valve. Now you get a spare one of these in your service kit. The old one that I took out was absolutely minging, but it will go in the lathe. I better clean that back up so we can actually refurb that, put a fresh seal on the old one, so we've obviously got some that we can rotate and keep it up and running. Now, I only ran this for a couple of minutes the other night. We've already got some moisture in there from just a sort of few moments of testing, just as a dry fit. What we want to do is get in there, cotton bud in there, give it a good clean out, make sure there's no moisture, no scum or anything in there. Not ideal, is it? We just need to get right down in here, give it all a good going over. Now I've already inspected the air inlet valve on the end here. It's just a simple metal flap, although we've got a little bit of dust on there. There's nothing really in there. That's just simply got a hole underneath of this. It draws air in, can't go back that way. So it's just a little one-way flap valve. These outer O-rings here, I've already swapped these over. So these are the cylinder heads to the cylinder bore. Right, so the fresh valve can go back in there. Need to put a fresh O-ring on that. O-rings in there nicely. Hopefully you can see on the end there, look, got that black moisture. Whether that's just corrosion of the copper, potentially, I'm not entirely sure. I'm going to pull this off of here now. I'll show you inside of the other end of the pipe. Pretty grotty looking. I mean, it's nicely machined. Look, we've got decent fittings on here, decent olives. So on one hand, it's actually half decent in terms of the machined parts. The parts that look like they're potentially handmade, hand folded and welded leave a little bit to be desired, but the biggest issue that you've got is that we've got no real moisture traps inside of this, so it's going to end up in your moisture filter before your rifle. If you can get the version that's got its built-in moisture trap and an oil separator, brilliant, but it's all a little bit cheap, and it was, to be honest. I mean, I got the cheapest version, more to see what happens if you ran a compressor without any service for 18 months, right? So in the bottom here of your bleed block, another small spring. Now we only got one bearing in our service kit, so I'll put that in here. Just going to give that a quick wipe out. Now these little seals in here, these are the ones that look like a little nylon seal. These are an absolute nightmare to change. This one was absolutely manky. It was all deformed. It was all black and scummy. I don't know whether I got a picture of that, but I had to pick that one out and it was an absolute nightmare. I had to push that back in. They're very, very tight fit in there. I'm surprised it's not an O-ring, but I managed to get it back in there. This needs dogging up quite tight, but I've got a funny feeling that we may have to resort to a bit of PTFE tape, which is really not ideal, but probably the best that we can do at the moment. So that's going back in there. Nothing interesting underneath of the gauge itself, and the same with the actual Foster fit on the end there, but I will show you in here as well actually on the bleed screw. I'm just going to quickly stick this in the soft jaws in the vise just to grab hold of it, do that one up quite tightly. So again, another little seal under here. Now strange enough, this one is absolutely undamaged. That's perfectly fine to put that one back together. So that's the original seal in there underneath of the Foster outlet there. That's absolutely fine, so that can go back together. So as you can see, they're really quite simple. We've got a little check valve in this side, we've got a check valve on this end of the compressor unit itself. Overall a really simple bit of kit, but what we do need to do next before we put that together is have a little examination of this and see whether or not we can drop this whole unit down just a smidgen relative to the motor. Right, we're going to start reassembling her now. I've given it all a good clean up. I've given the piston rings a good clean up. I've given it a decent wipe over. There's no scoring or anything on here. We've got a few little marks. But that will come off. We're going to scrape that off of there. Now the correct lubricant for this would be 100% pure silicone oil. I'm not going to use that myself, but that's what you ought to use. I'm going to be using silicone grease purely because I just need to satisfy my own curiosity. I'm guessing that the black scum that was in here was burnt up silicone oil. I have no idea if it was even lubricated from factory. I don't know how long it was running without lubricant. But what I'm going to do, I'm going to use this. You should use the right stuff, but I'm going to come back to this after I've done a few fills and see whether or not it's actually just scraped it back and forwards, because of course the piston ring is likely just to deposit that at each end of its stroke. But I want to try it to see whether or not it's any better than the oil. Like I say, this may have been running for, I mean, it may not have even had any oil in it from new, but the correct stuff is 100% silicone oil. That won't ignite under the great pressure of these. It won't diesel off and explode. So skim all the way around on the inside of the bore. Just going to put a little bit on these chamfers here as well, because that will then go onto these O-rings here. Now the actual cylinder bore itself can go either way around. Be very careful with your piston ring, don't want to damage that. Just pushes on, make sure there's no O-rings hanging out the end here. Looks pretty good. Right, so we've got the two ports at the top there. They're still loose at the moment. We'll get them in the correct position when we start bolting it back to the frame, but that's the orientation it needs to sit at. This is where it gets a little bit awkward. You need a third pair of hands. Go off that up to there. So it's gone through both parts of there. Hopefully you can see that in there. That's the peculiar one. That's probably why that one's not a captive nut. Maybe it makes it easier, I'm not entirely sure. Before we nip these up, just make sure everything's all aligned, make sure there's no obvious O-ring damage or anything like that, nothing hanging out where it shouldn't be. Now, unfortunately there's no misalignment in this either, so I still can't adjust the stroke on that crankshaft smacking the bottom of my big end on my rod, unfortunately. Right, I'm happy that that's all as true as we're going to get it. There's no obvious O-ring damage there, so we can just gently nip those up. Right, should put that little hard line back on there. Giving that a little clean up. There's no obvious damage to these. Now these are, as I said, olives. They don't need to be done up majorly tight. Right, let's give these a little nip up as well. My hands are freezing cold. It's absolutely bitter out here today. What I may well do, once we get this back in the casing itself and I've screwed this onto the actual body, I'll try and nip up those underneath because it's a bit awkward. Haven't got a lot to hold on to. Might have to just put an adjustable spanner on there possibly. Right, remember they're the shorter bolts. Bolt the two parts of the rod together. Now these were dogged up really tight from new. Just put some downward pressure on there. There's a tiny bit of misalignment in these, and that may well stop it knocking quite so badly. Good old-fashioned multi-purpose grease. Just slap that inside. Right, that'll do. Right, let's get this back into the cabinet then, shall we? Right, this was interesting. I had to manipulate that and put the little display up through the inside. And then before we get too far, just pull that loom through there. And we need to put that little tab back on the end of the compressor unit itself. Right, now this was the slightly trickier part. We need to get the motor bolted back into the cabinet itself. So I found that it was easier just to lay it on its side. Little rubber foot. See him there, look. Turns on there. Super sketchy twisty connector. Wiring's back on there. We need to screw that back onto the outside. Right, we're nearly there. Let's pop that back on there. Right, let's get the power supply on, see whether or not it's ever going to work again, shall we? Right, blocked off the fill hose there. Watch your ear rolls. I'm just going to run it without the fan for the moment. Let's just get the power on quickly. We'll put a little bit of pressure into the line to start with. Obviously that's now blanked off. We're just going to pressurise it maybe to 100 bar and then just check for any leaks. Right, that's on. Right. Well, she's alive. We're on 120 in the line there at the moment, or 12 megapascals. That's definitely the coolest measurement out there. Megapascal. Right, let's carry on then. Let's put the fan on this time. Well, we didn't get above 220. Oh, we've got a slight leak. Okay, well, we haven't replaced that ball bearing in there at the moment, so Well, I wonder if we've still got some additional wear or we've missed something inside of here. Yes, there's a slight leak from that bleed. I wonder if we've actually got a bit more internal damage on here than we thought. Now all the spares are available for this. I'm not going to chuck too much money at it. If we can keep it limping on, luckily most of my stuff I'm not filling to 300 bar. The Catran obviously I do, which is going to be a bit frustrating. Right, well she's alive, but I feel like she may be mortally wounded. I think for the moment what we're going to do is actually probably run it as it is for a couple of weeks. I'm going to probably order a new piston. Maybe there's some bore wear or something like that. I don't want to chuck too much money at it because ultimately going forward I think a Hills compressor is probably going to be the safest bet going forward. But what I did want to show you is this. This is one of my little 280cc buddy bottles, one of my day tripper ones. Now I've been filling that. Off of this I've also got a little blue inline filter, well not little actually, it's about 5 times the size of this, it's about this long, a blue inline filter. So I fill this buddy bottle from the compressor and then I, from this, top up the rifles when I need to with a different filter back so it gets double filtered. Now this has been in use for, I don't know, 6-7 months. Now, you're not going to be able to see in there very well, but I can assure you there's nothing remotely sort of looking dodgy in there. The bottle is all healthy. There's no corrosion, anything untoward in there. If there was, of course, I wouldn't be using it. So although the compressor itself was full of absolute crud, by the time you've got your sort of filters on the whip, nothing really seems to get into here at the moment. Certainly I'm not filling it when it's damp, I'm not filling it when it's wet, and I try and avoid filling it as much as I can when it's cold. So the buddy bottle itself looks pretty good. But is it actually worth buying one? So this cost me 140 quid. So running my dive bottle, I would have had probably 5 full top-ups since then. Now the boys charged a tenner for a fill, so I'd have spent 50 quid in bottle fills. Now the problem with that is that where I live, it's actually about a 35-mile round trip to actually get to the dive shop. So that's a gallon of fuel each way. 5 gallons of fuel is again probably another 30 quid. So at the moment, doesn't make good sense, does it? However, the problem that I've got here with dive shops is they're all too busy going off to look at fish, you know. It's always a nightmare getting to the dive shop. I end up losing pretty much a full morning in the workshop. So I basically lost 5 full mornings over the last 18 months, and that itself, 5 full mornings lost. It's always a bit of a pain in the backside getting the dive bottle filled where I live. You often have to wait. I end up having to mill around for a little while for them to top it up and everything else. Just the money that I've saved in actually being able to go to work and instead of actually going and driving out to the dive centre, that's well and truly covered the cost of this for the last 18 months. I mean, the reality of it is I could buy a new one of these right now and I'd still be in pocket for the next 18 months should it last like this one did. But I am going to spend a little bit of money on this one. We're going to come back to it and see how it performs. I think she's probably mortally wounded at the moment, but all of the parts for these are readily available. Tons of spares from AliExpress and places like that. Should I have bought heels? 600 quid, that would take quite a bit of time to recoup the costs on that. I think going forward that's probably what we will do for the channel, but we don't really have that sort of budget just for a compressor. Obviously I've still got dive bottles, I can get those filled. I don't necessarily think that these little shoebox compressors are a bad thing, but you do have to be super careful with the filtration. As you can see from this one, it's quite easy to actually get inside of it to service it. All the parts are readily available. Like I say, all I need now is to get myself another 5mm ball bearing to go in the actual bleed valve here. Other than that, she may well still have another bit of life in her. I'm going to do a few updates in the next couple of weeks on how it all pans out, but I'm on the fence really. I'm quite glad that we bought it. It's been quite interesting. It's been fun tearing it down. Obviously the first video that we did of this was a very popular video as well, so it's good for content. It's been incredibly convenient to have this up the farm if I need to just do a top up, especially when I'm filming. Being able to just quickly top up as and when I need to has been really good. The one thing that is actually pretty good is when it's quite cold outside, this fills the rifles quite slowly. They don't generate quite so much heat when it's filling like it would do off the dive bottle, which means less time letting the rifle reacclimatise after a fill. So in that instance, this is pretty good. Being able to fill up my little buddy bottles myself, again, very convenient. Should I have got a slightly better one? Well, at the moment, this hasn't really cost me anything. I'm quite happy with what I've purchased. It's lasted fair enough. I say it cost me 140 quid. I'm in pocket at the moment
let's see how it all pans out, shall we? We'll come back to this in a couple of weeks. So I will catch you in the next one, which will probably be some shooting actually if the weather plays ball, and then we'll see how this one goes in the future, shall we? I'll see you then.